And with that, we wanted to move to an interview with the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts, who is somebody of interest because the Heritage Foundation has been in the news quite a bit recently. The document that think tank produced, colloquially referred to as Project 2025, has become a major point of contestation among the Republicans and Democrats as it relates to the 2024 campaign. My working sense is that there are many aspects of that document, which I actually took the liberty of reading at least large portions of, that have not really been discussed much in the so-called mainstream media. So I'm glad to be joined by Kevin Roberts. Hello, sir.
Michael, thanks for having me. Looking forward to an intellectually honest conversation, whatever someone's political beliefs are, about Project 2025. So thanks for having me.
I appreciate that. So if you listen to the chatter in much of the liberal-oriented media, obviously they've converted Project 2025 into what they think is going to be their gold mine of an attack line against Donald Trump and the Republicans writ large. And, I did something, I guess, a bit unusual by media standards, which is I read the document. And there are portions of it that stood out to me as really getting no discussion whatsoever, at least as far as I've ascertained. And those, for me anyway, have to do with national security and foreign policy. So I wanted to discuss a few of those items with you, if you don't mind. So there's
Sure.
there's one bit. So obviously there are some recommendations that are made in terms of how to reorganize the bureaucracy of the federal government, including the intelligence services. And one prescription that is made is that Section 702 of FISA, the Surveillance Act, ought to be renewed and reauthorized. And that's been fairly controversial, including among the right, because the Fourth Amendment requires a warrant, and this authority is seen as authorizing warrantless surveillance, and only barely passed the House in April in terms of renewal. And I think actually Speaker Johnson cast the tie-breaking vote in favor of that reauthorization of FISA. So the section of the Project 2025 that I'm referring to here says that Section 702 should be understood as a, quote, essential tool in the fight against terrorism, malicious cyber actors, and Chinese espionage. And so it says that these authorizations need to be properly maintained and accountable, but that they should be retained nonetheless. So what is your sense of what Project 2025 proposes for that particular authority, FISA? It's been controversial throughout the Trump administration. Trump has criticized certain aspects of it as having been abused, but the fundamental authority, the document does propose be retained.
Yes, thanks so much for this conversation. We need to have more discourse like this in the United States, regardless of someone's political beliefs. So I'm really grateful to answer the question about the policy detail. And Michael, I'll make 2 points. One, from the standpoint of Project 2025, what you've read there is what's in the Mandate for Leadership book, the conservative promise, this conservative policy manual, if you will. And keep in mind, we wrote that 2 years ago, so well before the most recent vote on the issue. And the second point that I'll make is we do believe that the underlying authority of Section 702 should continue to exist, but especially those of us at the Heritage Foundation, which has facilitated this project, believe that there need to be very stringent, serious amendments added to that. And so during the last legislative conversation, the last legislative fight, Heritage, of course, just one part of Project 2025, was vocal about some of these amendments being added to the bill so that we could better protect innocent Americans. All of that to say that this has been extended into what would be the next presidential term, and either for Mr. Trump or it looks like Ms. Harris is the nominee for the left. And I think at that point we'll have the conversation about making those amendments again so that we can better protect Fourth Amendment.
Yep. Okay, so also on the intelligence community, which again raised a bit of a paradox for me, because I've seen a lot of people who on the right online who are actually in favor of Project 2025, anticipating that what's so great about it is that it'll fundamentally overhaul the intelligence services and maybe combat the deep state, which has become a main theme among online right-wing discourse, and also Donald Trump obviously rails against it because he feels understandably aggrieved by elements of the national security state that used unprecedented tactics to undermine him, whether it was through the Trump-Russia investigation, the Mueller special counsel investigation, etc., in his 2016 campaign, and then also in the early part of his first term. But I want to just read a quote here. Here's what it prescribes for the intelligence community, that is the Project 2025 document. It says, quote, "An incoming conservative president needs to use these intelligence authorities aggressively to anticipate and thwart our adversaries, including Russia, Iran, North Korea, and especially China." Now, that seems like the purpose of these bureaucratic reorganizations that are being proposed is to better entrench American primacy, right? To better expand American hegemony and to combat alleged adversaries, which is very much in keeping with the standard mission of the intelligence services, whatever tweaks you might want to make around the margins of how it's bureaucratically organized. Would that be a fair summation?
I think you're on the right track. I would put it a slightly different way, not to be argumentative, but just for the sake of clarity. We do want all of the law enforcement, military, intelligence agencies to continue to exist to serve the interest of the American people, that is, to be focused on our adversaries. But the clarification that I would make for you, Michael, is that, especially when you're using the term deep state, we need to eradicate those components of those agencies that have been turned against the American people ourselves, including and maybe especially considering what they've done to Mr. Trump. I can tell you, even though I'm sure many members of your audience are not in this category, as a Roman Catholic who happens to like the Latin Mass, we've been targeted as quote unquote domestic terrorists by the deep state. Pro-lifers have been targeted by the deep state. I no more want people on the political left to be targeted by the deep state because they're going about their respective affinity groups than I do myself want to be targeted. I think that's the bifurcation we need to make here, that we need the government to do its job properly understood, which is to be focused on our adversaries. We also need the government, especially these unelected bureaucrats in these intelligence agencies, to stop spying on us, to stop weaponizing the deep state against us. That's really the best way to understand this project, which is that it is a corrective against those abuses. And we look forward to the opportunity to be part of any effort that is going to achieve that aim.
Right, but fundamentally, the powers and authorities of the intelligence apparatus will continue to be arrayed against, for instance, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and especially China, which they're arrayed at now. You might quibble or contest various aspects of how those powers have been directed inward, and I would probably agree with a lot of that myself. But fundamentally, the main directive or purpose of the intelligence services will remain in place. So there will be, in a sense, bipartisan continuity on that score in terms of how those intelligence resources are marshaled.
Very, very well said, and thanks for putting it that way. And one good way to think about this, both in respect to the specific point that you're making about intelligence agencies, as well as a larger point about the purpose of Project 2025, is to restore constitutional order, to restore the proper role of these agencies, but also, and very much related to this particular conversation thread, to restore the proper role of each of the three branches of government. And I really do believe that the American people, maybe 2/3, 3/4 of the American people, understand that over the last several decades, there's been a real change, to put it mildly, in that constitutional order. And basically, this is a policy blueprint, particularly with these intelligence agencies, so that they can be focused on what they're supposed to do, which is equipping us with information about our adversaries while not turning that information against us inwardly.
So as you probably are aware, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, was in Washington, D.C. today. He addressed a joint session of Congress. He received many vigorous ovations, particularly from the Republicans, but also, I don't know, maybe half of the Democrats or so. There's still a lot of bipartisan continuity on that issue as well. So I want to just quote to you a portion from the Project 2025 document that does address itself to Israel. And now we should note that this document was written before the events of October 7th, 2023, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so here's one of the goals that the document sets out. It's to, quote, ensure that Israel has both the military means and the political support and flexibility to take what it deems to be appropriate measures to defend itself against the Iranian regime and its regional proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Now, does the Heritage Foundation, maybe if you want to update the document for the more recent events, does the Heritage Foundation really have a grievance with the amount of, quote, flexibility that the Biden administration has afforded Israel? As I mentioned in my introduction, I think there's a very good case to be made that Joe Biden has provided a greater quantity of armaments to Israel than any president in history. Not to mention the diplomatic support, the political support, the other forms of support, like symbolically going to Israel after October 7th. Now, I have some substantive objections to U.S. policy vis-a-vis Israel, but if what you're after is unflinching, unswerving support for whatever Israel thinks is necessary to defend its own security, it seems like Joe Biden has fit the bill for your purposes, hasn't he? Or are you anticipating that a Republican administration under Donald Trump would go even further? I don't know how much further you could go, but maybe there's some universe where it does go further that I can't currently envision.
Well, I will say that President Biden has been better on Israel than he was on the withdrawal of Afghanistan or from Afghanistan. But I would not go as far as to say that at Heritage or for those of us with Project 2025 that we think he's commended himself well. In fact, we do believe that in ways that maybe reading between the lines here, Michael, the president and his administration have really handcuffed Israel. They've prevented Israel from achieving the number one objective that needs to happen, which is getting American hostages back. Actually, President Biden and Vice President Harris truly deserve real scrutiny about that. But the second thing is they've really prevented, rather actively sometimes, the Biden-Harris administration they prevented Israel from fully prosecuting this war against Hamas. And I think that while, of course, it could be worse, I don't think we're necessarily going to grade them on a curve here, considering there were 20,000 protesters pro-Hamas in D.C. today, tearing down an American flag, and we're allowing that to happen on our soil. I think it's an indication of what the Biden-Harris administration has done in the Middle East.
But let me push back on you there, because the protesters, and I'm not in Washington, D.C., so I didn't go interview them myself, but I would assume that the protesters who were outside the Capitol today were not in favor of Joe Biden or Kamala Harris for that matter. In fact, they would have been very fervently protesting the current policy of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris because they view it to be excessively supportive of Israel, which they view as having unjustly pulverized Gaza and oppressed the Palestinians and so forth. So I don't understand this conventional, Republican line that tries to associate the current Democratic administration with the protesters who are literally protesting them. I mean, how is that being conflated? I understand the political salience and why you might want to conflate those things, but it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense logically.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I'm just talking as a policy conservative, not as a capital R Republican. Well, the reason they were protesting is because they believe that Biden and Harris should be doing nothing for Israel. But it doesn't follow logically that they're protesting that means that Biden and Harris have acquitted themselves perfectly, which is, again, not to be argumentative, sort of the underlying premise of your first question. Our point as policy conservatives is that Biden and Harris should be doing more to support Israel in the name of peace than they have. We understand that the protesters create an immense political problem for them, which is why Vice President Harris found it more important to be doing a campaign event than to serve her constitutional duty of being present for a major head of state giving a major address to Congress. That's a problem for the left to answer. I would respectfully submit to you, although I'm very happy to have the policy conversation in terms of what those of us who are conservatives would like to see.
Okay, so moving on, there's another section of the Project 2025 that has to do with foreign military sales. This is in the section on the Defense Department. It was authored by Christopher Miller, who was an acting defense secretary toward the tail end of the first Trump administration. And he declares that, quote, the United States must regain its role as the arsenal of democracy, because in his view, there has been a nosedive, that's an exact quote, of U.S. government foreign military sales, meaning of armaments to foreign countries. Now, on some portions of the right, there is an increasing skepticism or hesitation about what's sometimes unflatteringly referred to as the military-industrial complex, right, which is composed by, at least in large part, defense contractors, arms suppliers, arms producers, right? And what Project 2025 wants the next Republican or conservative administration to usher in is even fewer limitations on the ability of arms manufacturers to sell their wares around the world. In fact, one of the policy prescriptions in this section is that Congress should have even less oversight in reviewing the notifications that by custom are sent from the State Department to Congress about imminent or upcoming arms sales. So you want even less, I guess, congressional oversight over how these arms corporations or arms producers are receiving taxpayer largesse because they're hugely subsidized. I mean, these are basically state subsidized corporations, right? I mean, there's not much free market in that industry. So what do you make of that description that I just gave of that particular section?
Actually, it sounds like you, and especially those of us at Heritage, most of us at Project 2025, agree more than we disagree about the overarching objective here. And that is, we do want a very lethal, sparingly used American military. I think what you're getting at there with that comment is, or that part of the project, is that we are arguing for a greater efficiency for the speed of munitions deliveries. You think about our great ally, Taiwan. There's been a real issue with the delivery of munitions for many years. I hear that all over the world as I travel for my job. The point is not to have less oversight, but to have greater efficiency for the sake of protecting Americans. I happen to agree with you, all of us at Heritage do, Michael, that we have to have a dramatic overhaul of our defense industrial base. We are spending way too much money on outdated munition systems and not having a serious enough policy conversation about what the next war will need in terms of munitions. Congress gets in the way because of the politics of this. We're not saying that Congress should get out of that. We're actually arguing that Congress should muster some political courage to have these very important and difficult policy conversations. And that thread really is the overriding theme of the Department of Defense component of Project 2025. Something I might add has pretty significant bipartisan support, which is that we sort of revitalize Reagan's peace through strength, do so in a way that is fiscally responsible, but that most of all also protects American interests at home and abroad.
So you mentioned Taiwan. Also in that DoD section authored by Christopher Miller, he prescribes that the U.S. should, quote, prioritize the U.S. conventional force planning construct to defeat a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Now, maybe I'm crazy, but it seems like going to war with China is maybe something that should be debated and deliberated ahead of time before we just kind of presumptively commit to it as a nation. I mean, that could be catastrophic. I mean, the casualness and almost the frivolity with which that prospect is discussed, I have to say, especially within DC think tank circles, never ceases to amaze me. So are we just kind of assuming that a second Trump administration or a forthcoming Republican administration would just operate on the working assumption that should there be some sort of Chinese incursion, meaning the PRC, into Taiwan, meaning the ROC, that would automatically obligate the U.S. to commit unknown military resources and effectively begin a war with China? I mean, that's almost a mind-boggling concept, and it seems like that's the implicit assumption in a lot of what I see, not just in Project 2025, but I have to say, pull up virtually any DC think tank policy paper on Taiwan, and you'll see something similar.
Well, let me allay your concerns, my friend. First and foremost, President Trump, I think, even for people on the left, deserves an immense amount of credit for having started no wars in his presidency. He is a man of great peace. Obviously, he speaks for his policy priorities, not me or anyone with Project 2025. But if you look at President Trump's public pronouncements, both as president and since, about the question of Taiwan, what you should expect from him, just based on his own public record, is that there would be great peace, that he would go out of his way more than any other president to avoid a direct conflict with China. And we ought to celebrate that across the political spectrum. I'm a historian. It is amazing historical record as it relates to peace under his presidency. But the second thing, to your wonderful point about DC think tanks, I say that leading a DC think tank, Heritage, you may not know, has been leading the effort on the political right to get us out of this neoconservative adventurism that has really cost way too many American lives and way too much money. In fact, we're often called the restrainers or the prioritizers. And as it relates to Taiwan, we are huge advocates to arm them for the sake of deterrence, so that the United States does not have to send our own very precious military men and women there to do that. So there's a much larger context here that I think is an important part of the conversation. And I mentioned the context not to be evasive, but for the exact opposite. There is a movement afoot, Michael, in this on the political right to move back to our roots of being much more restrained as it relates to just sort of flippantly talking about defending this country or that country. And I think that's the kind of thing that ought to allay your concern legitimately.
Well, I do think there's a fine line between deterrence and provocation or instigation. We were told before 2022 that U.S. policy in Ukraine was geared toward deterring Russia. In fact, that was one of the grounds on which Donald Trump started sending lethal weaponry to Russia for the first time in 2017. And so I want to just move to the Russia portion of the State Department section of the Project 2025 document. So this is by Kiran Skinner, is I think how you pronounce her name?
Dr. Kiran Skinner, yes.
And she basically seems to posit that there's a conservative viewpoint that's become a consensus, or at least she's trying to present it as a bit of a consensus, that it, quote, eschews both isolationism and interventionism. And she tries to relate this concept to Ukraine. And she says that basically the final calculus on that is that continued U.S. involvement must, quote, be fully paid for, limited to military aid, while European allies address Ukraine's economic needs and have a clearly defined national security strategy that does not risk American lives. Okay, so I was at the Republican convention last week in Milwaukee. I talked to a lot of Republican members of Congress about Ukraine policy. A large number of them who voted even against the Ukraine funding portion of the National Security Supplemental in April told me that they have no real principled opposition to funding or arming Ukraine. In fact, rather, they echoed basically the logic that's spelled out here in Project 2025, which is that to the extent there is U.S. involvement in Ukraine, it must be more narrowly tailored. So you want it to just be military aid rather than economic aid, like, funding pensions or that kind of thing in Ukraine. And they want European allies to pick up a greater share of the burden. Well, I mean, the EU in February, I think it was, passed another 50 billion euro to actually, subsidize a larger portion of that economic aid component. And in terms of a clearly defined national security strategy, well, that's just basically a process argument saying that we need something that's a little bit more clear-cut in terms of the policy framework set out by the administration. My point is there's no underlying principled opposition to intervention in Ukraine here, so far as I can tell in this document, and that does seem to be reflected in an emerging consensus view within a lot of Republican elected official circles.
Yeah, if I follow your question, and I've been, I guess, more deeply involved in this question than practically any conservative who's not an elected official in D.C. the last couple of years, I can tell you what the principled objection is, and that is we ought not be sending $200 billion to any country without having a very clear strategic objective. And it's one that has become a slippery slope toward having our own military on the ground. In fact, I'm a little surprised if there's a difference of opinion between you and me on this, because I love where you were going with your point about Taiwan leading up to something you and I no doubt would agree on, which is that there must be declarations of war, more often when in fact there is war. Obviously, we hope that there isn't a lot of war. This case is becoming close to that. We've been told for 2 years that Ukraine could win this war. Obviously, we want them to, but it's also become very obvious in the last 6 months, even among EU leaders who've been sort of selling us a bill of goods, that the Ukrainians cannot win. I think what the upshot here is that if President Trump wins, if you listen to what he has said the last few months about this issue, that we can expect a move toward protecting Ukrainian sovereignty while also understanding that we've got to bring this conflict to an end. That underlying principle is not just American restraint. It's not just a process argument. It's an argument about constitutional authority and having a conversation as a country about what is in the best interest of the United States of America. That I think we need more of rather than less of it.
I don't disagree at all about the lack of constitutional authorization for a whole bevy of U.S. Military interventions, including Ukraine, going on right now. So no argument there for me. I'm just noting that in Project 2025, it effectively endorses the continuation of arming Ukraine. And it doesn't declare, it doesn't say, it says limited to military aid. U.S. involvement must be fully paid for and limited to military aid.
No, it's a misreading of it. It's if I may say so respectfully, what we're trying to do is impose a criteria that Congress has not filled. They've not stated the strategic objective. They've not talked about the criteria for getting out of there. There is a terrible lack of transparency. If that criteria doesn't exist, then that is not at all a blank check to continue in Ukraine.
Okay, let's just pull that up on the screen really quick, if the control room could do that, just so people are aware of what I'm referencing. This is the Russia section, and I just want to have people for the record. So this is what's this? This is basically the conclusion in the State Department section of Project 2025. And go on a little further, please. That's right. Thus, with respect to Ukraine, U.S. involvement must be fully paid for, limited to military aid, while European allies address Ukraine's economic needs and have a clearly defined national security strategy that does not risk American lives. So if military aid is what U.S. involvement must be limited to, isn't that an endorsement of the continuation of military aid? I guess I'm not sure what I'm misreading.
No. The aid that we have sent there, the $200 billion that I've pointed out, isn't just military aid. It fails that criterion. It fails the criterion of transparency. There has been huge objection by none other than Mitch McConnell to having a much stronger inspector general there. And I just disagree with you, Michael, that we've actually fulfilled that third part, which is that there's some sort of strategic objective that's been articulated here.
I'm not arguing that a strategic objective has been adequately spelled out by the Biden administration. In fact, there hasn't been. It's just been strategic muddle. Right. They don't actually spell out what the end point even is. In May, Biden authorized Ukraine to start using U.S. weaponry to strike inside territorial Russia, and we don't even know what the geographic range of within Russia that Ukraine is permitted to strike is. So I'm not arguing that. I'm just noting that it seems like this argument endorses continuing the war in Ukraine. But maybe I'm reading too much into it. People should look at it for themselves. I do want to ask you one final question, and you'll have to indulge me because this might sound like an MSNBC type question, but I hope I've established that that's not the approach I wanted to take with this interview. But it is true that Donald Trump keeps denouncing and disavowing Project 2025. He did so just again today on Truth Social. Why is Donald Trump so rapidly distancing himself from Project 2025? Which is, it is true that a lot of people who are alum of the first Trump administration were involved in crafting this document, including Christopher Miller, whose section on the Department of Defense we were just discussing, and Ms. Skinner on the State Department. So what's going on here?
You've definitely earned the benefit of the doubt, not for that to be perceived as an MSNBC question. So don't worry about that. I've enjoyed the conversation. But to cut to the chase, look, President Trump is running a presidential campaign, and the left has succeeded in mischaracterizing almost everything about Project 2025. And so I think the former president hit the nail on the head today when he said, don't believe this, I think he called it disinformation from the left. Don't believe them. That's the key thing. I think it's incumbent upon us who are behind Project 2025 to continue to correct the record. They've gotten only two things right. The first is, as President Trump has indicated, the campaign is totally separate from this project. That's been the way things work since the beginning. But secondly, the one thing that the left gets right is that we do want to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. It's a very popular concept, and this fifth-generation educator who only went to public schools looks forward to American education being improved as a result.
Well, Ronald Reagan campaigned on abolishing the Department of Education in 1980, and famously, the Heritage Foundation would boast that Reagan came into office in 1981 with binders full of Heritage Foundation recommendations and personnel to hire, and lo and behold, the Department of Education was never abolished. And I think even in 2016, Trump indicated that he would be open to abolishing the Department of Education. So that's just a long-standing kind of DC conservative ambition, right? So there's nothing particularly new about it. Whatever you think of it on the merits, the idea that it represents some like dramatic new apocalyptic totalitarianism, that's absurd. I mean, I think if there is a more legitimate critique to make, it's just that it's bog standard DC conservatism, frankly.
Well, you know, as you've discovered, I would quibble with you in a friendly way about that last point, but I'd rather that policy conversation, which to your credit has been so intellectually honest, than the mischaracterization that has happened on purpose. I mean, even Kamala Harris's campaign staffer today admitted that they were purposefully misconstruing Project 2025. And to the credit of both USA Today and CNN, they did a fact check on them and basically have landed where you have, which is we might have policy differences about Project 2025, but it certainly is not some dystopian plan for ending the United States. Quite the opposite. We want to restore self-governance. So thank you, Michael, for being such a good conversationalist on the issue.
Well, I certainly would not be surprised if a Kamala Harris staffer deliberately misconstrued something for political purposes. So, you know, my face does not have a look of shock on it upon hearing that. Well, Kevin Roberts, I appreciate you coming on, having what I hope was a substantive discussion about an issue that's become really contentious, obviously, in the current campaign. Hopefully this added to people's understanding of what Project 2025 entails. And once again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you immensely. Enjoyed it and look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
All right, thanks. Okay, so that was Kevin Roberts, and that was hopefully illuminating for many of you. On Project 2025. I actually wrote something for my own personal site or a Substack on mtracy.net. Sorry to do a shameless plug, but what I wrote was headlined, Project 2025 is basically just Project 1981. And what I meant by that is that this idea that Project 2025 represents this like tyrannical overturning of the constitutional order is belied by the fact that the Heritage Foundation really is just the standard DC conservative think tank, whatever you may think of it. So the idea that they're going to like blow up the American system of government just makes no sense, yet that's how it's been largely depicted in the hysterical liberal-oriented media because they want an attack line against Trump. Now, there are legitimate critiques to be made of lots of the stuff in Project 2025, much of which I mentioned with Kevin Roberts. But none of it really aligns with these hyperbolic liberal fantasies, which really have no basis in reality. And in fact, on a lot of the core national security and foreign policy prescriptions in that document, the liberals are fully aligned with Project 2025. They should be cheerleading and dancing in the streets at how much bipartisan consensus Project 2025 really portends on combating Russia, on marshaling U.S. military and intelligence resources to fight China. There's tons of bipartisan continuity that is elaborated in this document, as I think at one point Kevin Roberts even affirmed. So that's something interesting to note. And I don't know, maybe we'll cover Project 2025 a little more. I'm in a way hesitant to spend too much time talking about what DC think tanks do because, I mean, they're really just, I mean, if you talk about Washington consensus, that's what you're referring to for the most part, DC think tanks. And yet Democrats and MSNBC are like having everybody light their hair on fire and run around in circles over the most conventional, almost banal stuff that it really is annoying.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.